We are live. Hi, Sid. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hey, Grace. Thank you
Uh,
for having me.
to start the show, I would love for the audience to learn more about you. So, you started your career in investment banking, and you have worked as like project managers and private equity associate. So, like, I feel like you went through the very, like, I guess like finance approach into venture capital. Why don't we start with like what were some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that kind of shape you into who you are today?
Yeah, so very quickly for your listeners and the audience, the kind of my background and how I kind of came into the wonderful world of venture was through a pretty finance oriented route. So I went to Cornell, like your prior guest. I studied economics and biology, and then post that went into investment banking and ended up covering enterprise software companies, and was fortunate to kind of be dropped into covering cybersecurity and IT infra companies. And that was probably the only, big smart decision I made early on in my career, was stick to that those two subsectors, the
Mhm.
cybersecurity and IT infra subsectors, because today, obviously, both of those subsectors have become very, very large in our broader kind of business ecosystem, and certainly in the technology innovation ecosystem. And then the second thing I did was, try to go and figure out, how do I get my path to ultimately becoming a venture capitalist. And in
Mhm.
my case, I had the advantage at Cornell. I'd started this, venture capital club where we worked with VCs on real life projects. The club is still very much in existence today and very active at Cornell. So I had some context on what it was like being, a VC. I'd never kind of done it, but I tried to create a path for myself to eventually make it, into this industry. And I didn't think I'd make it as quickly as I ended up making it, but
Mhm.
that was a certain learning. So it was kind of investment banking, then followed into private equity, which is very operationally focused, and then subsequently into venture.
For sure. I feel like one of the things about like I guess like your career that I thought were really interesting is like I think you're very entrepreneurial. So beside the Cornell Venture Capital Club that you also co-founded Cyber Seed, which is a forum over 500 early stage aspiring founders to like share about their journey of like building security startups. Why don't we talk about some of these like initiatives and then how it kind of helps you, whether it's like deal sourcing to diligencing, like how do you kind of like build out your own quote unquote platform to like contribute to your investment journey?
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I think a big part of kind of learning for
Mhm,
me and growing as a venture capitalist is, how do we go and
mhm,
enable community? And that's
mhm,
very, very important at the stage that we operate at Foundation Capital. We are typically leading either the first or second institutional round in our
mhm,
startups. So usually when we get involved, it's either just the team, or the team
mhm,
and a little bit of product, but it's certainly not, a lot more than
mhm,
that. And that's a big learning in terms of, what can we do to kind of create an opportunity.
mhm,
So, as a result of that, my goal of creating these communities is always about, how do we kind of, go and find founders before they become founders.
mhm,
And a big part of this is, can we go and find these individuals very, very early on in their decision making behind, starting a company. And one of those kind of communities is certainly CyberSeed. It was a community I started with two other good friends in the depths of COVID. And the whole concept back then was, can we
mhm,
go and create a community of pre-seed and seed stage founders, as well as people who wanted to become founders, that
mhm,
would allow them to go and, interact with one another and hear from great successful founders in cybersecurity. So we started it in early 2021. It's certainly been going on now well over 4 years. At the time when we started, it used to be monthly virtual events. Now we've transitioned to not just virtual, but also in person. In fact, we do an in person event every roughly 2 months, including at larger conferences. And that community has gone from obviously 0 people to, as you mentioned, 500 people on the Slack, another almost 2,000 on the newsletter. So it's a great community of kind of early stage founders. And the advantage for me is that it allows me to kind of connect with people who are not in our portfolio. So there may
mhm,
be a whole set of people who don't end up kind of in being ones that we end up investing in, but we certainly want to kind of continue to go and stay connected with them. So it's a great opportunity to kind of stay in touch with a group
Mhm.
of people that you end up not investing in. And the great thing about kind of building communities like this is that these individuals end up kind of working with you, and
Mhm.
realizing that, hey, Sid is adding some value, even though I'm not one of his portfolio companies. He's helping me on that journey of going and finding out how to think about go to market strategies, or how to think about hiring my first few executives, by connecting me to the kind of the more successful founders in the category. So that's
Mhm.
one community that we've started. Another thing that I did was, you mentioned in the pre kind of session before this, we talked a little bit about Ross. So alongside Ross and Mahendra, I started this podcast, not as
Mhm.
large as your podcast, Grace, but it's very much a
It's
technical
it's very
podcast focused
cool.
on cybersecurity.
Yes, I was listening, and then also like I feel like it was like very it was kind of like a business casual conversation. I feel like it's a really good conversation because since you guys have been working in the industry for so long, so like also like I feel like kudos to Ross. Like I feel like he built like a brand within a very short amount of time and at a really cool newsletter. And then I was listening to your US podcast. I feel like there was a lot of like information that obviously I would not think of asking since like I don't work in security every single day. But those are like some really great conversations. But
Yeah,
highly
no,
recommended. Shout out to the pod.
thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, and for those listening, it's called Inside the Network. Thank you, Grace, for saying that. Means a lot. I think the focus for us there was saying, hey, can we go and create something that is very sector focused in cyber, and
Mhm,
also go and bring our network of successful founders who have gone and built public companies and scaled up really large enterprises, and really talk with them about their kind of career journey and how they came about
mhm.
going and starting those companies, and what was the arc that allowed them to go and build a truly enduring business.
For sure. I have a question on that. Like, so what are your favorite questions to ask people? Also, I referred your podcast to in the last episode that was like an hour ago with Mark about like I think one of my biggest lesson was like from listening to your podcast was like as a regular consumer, like I don't think about security whatsoever. Like, I mean, I think about like, yeah, like, whenever I see like, the Apple breach or whatever, like the password breach, or like sometimes I type in a password, it's like already compromised. But I don't really know what that meant. So, like, so ideally, like my bank account's not gonna be affected by this, hopefully knock on wood. But the problem is like as a regular day consumer, or like small business owner or like a founder in general, I think people don't think about security at all, and but it's like such a critical part in our daily life. Imagine like I feel like imagine you have to deal with like the I guess like the back end problem of life, which is like I feel like secure where security is. It is like very hard like when shit goes wrong basically. And I wonder how what are some questions that you would ask your guests, and then like what is on top of mind of these like security experts.
Yeah, I think so. I think the amazing thing about cyber is, I've been fortunate to cover it for the last 12 years. And I'd say 12 years ago, there was very much cyber was considered a very niche category. And I remember
Mhm,
I ended up covering it in banking, Grace, because it was not considered a category that would go and create very large
mhm,
companies. There was this
mhm,
view that there were these three very, very large businesses, and they would be the only businesses. And at the
mhm,
time, there was Symantec, McAfee, and Checkpoint. And yes, there was, Trend Micro and Fortinet, some of the smaller businesses, but the view was this is it. This is the market.
mhm,
And I think what has changed since then is we have seen a massive increase in the
mhm,
number of not just startups, but also public companies. I mean, we have over 20 public companies in cybersecurity today. It's more than any other subcategory in technology. Like, just for your listeners to recognize, like it is the
mhm,
largest by far. Um,
mhm,
and the reason that that has happened is because our world has shifted from the physical world to the digital world. And one big thing, if you go to the early 2000s, the
mhm,
concept of putting all your information like you and I do, putting your resume online
mhm,
for everyone else to publicly be able to see was considered not just foreign, but actually a terrible idea.
mhm,
And today, most of the internet population is on social media. It's over
mhm,
95%. For
mhm,
context, I wrote that you reference this blog post in the in the promotion for this conversation, but I wrote a blog post back in 2019, right before RSA, which is the largest cyber conference, that cybersecurity would be the next $1 trillion market.
Mhm.
And as I was trying to explain why that was the case, the point that we at Foundation were trying to make was, roughly about 60% of the internet population in 2019 was, in the hold on, sorry, oh, just zoomed out for a second, was yeah, roughly about 60% of the internet population was, on social media. Today, it's about
Mhm.
95%.
Mhm.
And, roughly just under, just about 2 billion people were on social media in 2019. Today, it's
Mhm.
well over 5 billion. So it's just truly amazing that that has happened. So our world has shifted from the physical world to the digital world. The same
Mhm.
applies to, banking. Most of banking 10, 12 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, but all of banking was done, you know, going to a physical branch. 10, 12
Mhm.
years ago, most of it was still done in physical branches. Today, I'd argue that many people haven't gone to a physical branch in a very, very long time. So there's been a
Mhm.
pretty dramatic change and shift in terms of how people think about things. So
Mhm.
that's one big factor just to consider. So all those things really create why we are seeing a world where cybersecurity is just more and more important. It's more important because we've shifted to the digital world, and just like we're protecting the physical world with physical armies and security guards at a bank, we have to go and do the equivalent amount of protection in the digital world. So it's a big change that we've seen.
For sure. I wanna talk about one more, I guess, like, I wouldn't say side project, but like I guess like the system that you have built for yourself before we jump into your amazing portfolio companies. One thing is like you have a lot of like security experts or like as a CTO, CIO, CISOs, basically the Fortune 200 buyers. Um, you're doing like a lot of these dinners, right? So like basically you host a lot of gathering for the CIOs, CTOs, and CISOs, right? So I guess number one is, do you have content at these dinner? Like, what do people typically talk about offline? I think that's probably very different than like what everybody say online, right? So, how do you think about like the insights that you were gathering from these dinners and from the buying perspective? Like, how do you effectively leverage the in-person network into something that you would use for later on to, help either diligence an investment or like, helping generate ideas or like deal flows to a degree to like kind of like have them help you with partially either diligence or like sourcing or either winning the deal kind of like process. Since by
Yeah.
the way, I think it was really impressive that because of you came from a finance background, you kind of built this whole thing on your own to like for you to have like more domain knowledge as well as like, building up the network. I think it's like takes a lot of like initiatives to like do or like to build this whole thing.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So let me try to answer the second question first, and then I'll go to the
Mhm.
first question. On the second question on, why does this matter? How does this help, and why does this matter? I think the
Mhm.
difference is that depending on the sector you cover in technology, and from an early stage investment perspective,
Mhm.
customers, vary. So if you're a
Mhm.
consumer investor, and there's some amazing
Mhm.
consumer investors, it's very hard to go and kind of
Mhm.
survey the entire population. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. In
Mhm.
enterprise software, certainly in infrastructure software, which is where security
Mhm.
and IT is focused, the difference is that it actually is very possible for you to go and survey the customer base, because there's a finite customer base. There's a set of customers who matter, and there's a set of customers who will be the early adopters. It's very hard
Mhm.
when you're going after the broader population. I mean, there's whatever 8-9 billion people in the world. How do you determine who are going to be the early adopters, and why would they indicate trends? That's
Mhm.
very much more possible in cybersecurity and IT. So
Mhm.
with that in mind, when I first started covering the space, my big point was trying to understand what are customers thinking. And 10 plus years ago, the concept of surveying customers, certainly reaching out to CISOs and CTOs, was pretty foreign. And even on their side, I mean, many of them weren't that comfortable trying out new startups. candidly, there hadn't been a lot of new startups that had been created. There was a very finite number of them, and Symantec and McAfee and Checkpoint and Trend and Fortinet were the big players. The view was, those are the incumbents, and we're just going to keep using them. And if somebody becomes really big, then we'll look at them at that point. I think the big thing was over the past decade, I spent a lot of time trying to just reach out to these people. And at the time that I was doing that, they didn't have a lot of VCs reaching out. So most of the time, the first question was, what do you do? And, what is startups? And, it's today, I think most CISOs and CTOs know what we do. So it's relatively easy to have a conversation with them. But back then it wasn't. And most of those people 10 years ago, the CISO role has also been elevated. So, a decade ago, the CISO wasn't called a CISO. It was likely somebody who was a security manager who reported into someone, who reported into someone, who reported into the CIO. So the concept was also very, very early. So many of the times when I was speaking to the person who was running security or who was running IT, those individuals were much more accessible. And my big point was highlighting to them that really being an early adopter of technology would add a lot of value for them on their tech stack and on their goals, and help them eventually become much more senior in their roles. And I think that today has worked out obviously very well for all of those individuals. It certainly worked out for us as a kind of startup industry. But how that started off was one factor. The second thing I think is today, what does that look like? Today I have well over 350 kind of CISOs, CIOs, CTOs who I speak to, and depending on the individual, I spend a lot of time trying to assess, do I talk to them every month? And there's a very finite number of people I speak to every month. It's just about 15 people, and it rotates depending on the year. And these are the individuals who are going to be very, very early adopters. Then there's a group of people who I speak to roughly, twice a year, so every half year. And then there's a group of people who I speak to quarterly, and those people, a little bit more active than the every half a year. But across the 350, I bucket them into those three groups. So those are individual one-on-one conversations. And then on top of that, I layer it with these events. And you mentioned, some of the dinners we host at Foundation. We also host events during conferences. We have a big conference at Black Hat coming up. And we host a lunch that this now our 8th year doing it. We host an equivalent event at RSA. And then we host kind of these dinners in our offices roughly every 3 months or so. It used to be a lot more common pre-COVID. It's become a little less as people don't come into the office as actively. So the goal really with these sessions is usually for the larger events, I try to bring in 1 or 2 kind of leaders who are innovating, either CISOs or CIOs or CTOs. And I have them talk about what are they doing in their organization, and allow the other CISOs and CIOs and CTOs to go and, ask them questions. And then the second bucket is more kind of, sit down and have a workshop type of session. So talk about a specific topic. Maybe it's where AI meets cybersecurity as an area, or what's the future of identity security, a topic like that, and have a conversation around it. Usually these are areas that I'm thinking about myself. So they are fantastic ways to answer your question, for me to kind of go and assess where is the puck flowing, and how can we go and invest behind that opportunity. The second bucket, sometimes I'm diligencing an active opportunity, and these individuals help me to go and assess that. And then sometimes there are areas where these individuals find that they have a core area that they're really focused and excited about, and I'm able to match that with a company either that we're invested in or looking at or just know, so that they can be an early design partner.
I wonder, do you have like systems to track it? I feel like for like a one-off project, so like I feel like I made a lot of introduction that I have hard time to track. But on the other hand, I feel like as a career VC or like career investor, you have to systematically build a system that kind of like track these conversations, or from, I guess, like this 3 badge of like, or like 3 different like bracket of like people, are like how frequently you engage with these people. I guess, how do you track the conversation results? Or so, for example, I'm sure, let's say CISO of this Fortune 500 company and this Fortune 500 company, they probably have different needs. And then how do you kind of like finalize the
Figure out
information
who to
into
focus.
something? Yeah, exactly. And then sometimes like when you meet a startup, like it's all all about, I feel like it's a lot of it is like recency bias. Like recently I tried with X, so like X is on top of my mind, but like and then you just kind of like forget about the rest. Like, but I feel like a lot of times, like I don't know how, like do you use like a CRM? I'm sure like you use some sort of like, I don't know, affinity equivalent or something, but what's your effective way to actually um like, digest these information and then making them into like effective deal pipeline like funnel for yourself?
Yeah, great question. So, we use Affinity, and certainly I have kind of an affinity list for founders that I'm tracking, as well as
Mhm,
startups that I've met. Then there's an equivalent affinity list for kind of CISOs that I'm tracking, and CISOs that I've met. And in that, Grace, to your point, on the CISO and CIO and CTO list, I have kind of a bucket for: am I meeting this person, monthly? Am I meeting them quarterly? Am I meeting them, once, half a year? And that, I usually change that bar, and
mhm,
usually I make those changes happen sometime in the summer or sometime in December. So the slower periods, that's when I go through the list and say, okay, well, who am I going to, kind of up level, or who am I going to down level? Not because they're not helpful, but they may be going through a different set of things in their
mhm,
organization that may not make sense for them to be early adopters.
mhm,
Whereas the opposite could happen. There may be an opportunity to be an early adopter because of something that's happening in the organization.
mhm,
In addition to that, I use OneNote for all of my note tracking, whether that's with, meeting with founders or meeting with customers. And I put in, when I meet with a customer, I try to understand what are their top three priorities. Because,
mhm,
anything that's below top three, candidly, they're not going to look at a startup for that solution. So I
mhm,
try to understand what are the top three priorities, and those top three priorities could change. Sometimes they're the same, and that's also an indicator. Uh,
mhm,
so I try to understand what is that. And then on the startup side, I'm always constantly looking at, okay, well, what do these companies do, and what do I roughly bucket these companies into? And based on that, I go and try to identify when a customer highlights a area that they're interested in, what is an equivalent set of startups. And usually I don't, I'll come in with my point of view. I'll say, hey, I think XYZ company is the best in this sector, but here are the three or four others that also matter and you should also evaluate. So I come in with my point of view, but I also try to give them the lay of the land so that they can make an independent decision. I think the hardest part for customers is that if they don't feel you're being, you know, unbiased, then they have less reason to trust you. So my focus is always in making sure that these conversations don't feel like pitching conversations. It's not
mhm,
just I'm ramming, every startup that we've invested in at foundation down their throats. It's that I'm hopefully helping them think about, what are the areas and strategies that they should care about and are interesting
mhm.
to them.
I wanna I feel like that's such a great framework. I'm totally gonna write them all down. I mean, I took some notes like while you were saying I was typing, but I'll totally digest them in the later right after our conversation. So I want to dive into your like exits first, and then we can talk about like foundation strategy, your strategy on getting these deals. But so you have a lot of notable exits, so like CloudKnox, Response Software, MistNet, like and a bunch of others. So like a lot of them were acquired by other security companies. Why don't we talk about the like cybersecurity ecosystem, like who is acquiring what, and we could talk about like the made up of the founder, because I think there was a lot of like top security investor on our show. I think everyone was really focusing on the Israel people. Literally, like I was like in offline like dinners with like a CISO, and then their point of view is like the 90% security company matters all coming from the 8200 vibe. So like I guess like how do you think about, like first of all, like how does the security investing ecosystem kind of look like? What does a typical exit look like? And then we could trace down to like who are the founders and what's their like kind of typical profile.
Yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot said out there. I think on the controversial point that 90% of companies come from the 8200, candidly, actually don't agree with that. Now, obviously, I wouldn't.
Mhm,
But I think the better way for your, the audience listening in, as well as the CISO who told you that, to really assess that is if you look at the 20 plus cybersecurity companies that are public, a very small, finite number of them came out of Israel. And if you look at, all the companies that have gone public in the last 5 years, as well as that potentially could go public in the next 5 years, again, a very small, finite number of those are Israeli companies. So,
Mhm.
it's not to say that Israel isn't important. Believe me, it is very important. We think about it all the time.
Mhm.
I think Israel is certainly punching above their weight, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that they're the only kind of subsegment. And then the second point is actually the Unit 8200. I think there's lots of companies that are built out of Israel where the founders didn't come from Unit 8200.
Mhm.
I think that that's also something that sometimes we don't recognize, but as you spend more time, whether that's in cyber or just broadly in Israel, you start to
Mhm.
recognize that yes, Unit 8200 absolutely matters, but there's a whole bunch of other units that people who weren't in one of the intelligence units that end up going and building amazing companies,
Mhm.
and you just have to keep an open mind. I think that they
Mhm.
are great people. But again, I think the broader point, that is Israel punching above its weight in cyber? Absolutely. Is Unit 8200 a big area for opportunity? Absolutely. It's just,
Mhm.
is it all of the market? I disagree on that point.
Mhm.
I think on the kind of broader point on what does the cybersecurity market look like, I think the market is actually a very, very acquisitive market. And the reason
Mhm.
it's acquisitive is partly because there are so many different cybersecurity companies that are at reasonable scale. And
Mhm.
because they're at reasonable scale, they're constantly looking at what is our next area of innovation. And some of that innovation comes from within, but candidly, a lot of innovation always will come through acquisition, certainly at a large scale. So what we see is when one company, let's pick
Mhm.
Palo Alto Networks, buys a startup in one category, many of Palo Alto's core competitors will think about what is our equivalent response to that. How do we go and cover that sector so that when customers come to us, they say, hey, Palo Alto is now covering this new kind of area. What is your response? Can you cover it for me too? They have an answer. And we've certainly seen that, with data security posture management as one area, or security orchestration, the SOAR market as another area, where there have been multiple acquisitions that have happened in a kind of subsector
Mhm.
across multiple different public companies. Um, I think on the IPO side, I mean, candidly, the IPO markets have been tough, period. So,
Mhm.
it's been hard, but there are a whole bunch of amazing cybersecurity companies that will likely go out and become public
Mhm.
in the next, give or take 2 years. And it's only a matter of time. And, even in, the past few years, if you look at Rubrik as one company that has recently gone public and certainly is categorized in cybersecurity, the market still is quite active on the public
Mhm.
side.
For sure. Okay, so I wanna quickly give a shout out to our quick sponsor segment. I'm sorry, but this is like the new thing I'm testing to be. I used to like put, since you're another fellow podcaster, so I hope you understand this. But anyway, at the beginning, I did all the commercials at the very beginning, and now I'm trying to to test which segment is the best. But quick shout out to our amazing sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Verivent. If you're a GP or LP looking to simplify the capital raising and deployment process, Verivent is here to help. Trusted by over 800 funds and managing more than $2 billion transactions, Verivent offers a secure, streamlined payment platform designed specifically for your private capital market. Say goodbye to the manual reconciliation and repeated follow-ups. Raise and deploy capital faster and with greater transparency. Ready to make your fund operation smoother? Visit Verivent.com and see how easy it can be. And by the way, we'll drop the bit.ly link. Please click. Anyway, back to our show. Um, I wanted to I think one of the things that you mentioned very interesting is for example, Rubrik or other companies will categorize in the security sector. Why don't we start with what is a security startup? And what are the common things that people are building for? So typically I feel like a lot of I think maybe because of I'm a small angel investor in some of the pre-seed companies. So the company that when I'm looking at them, they're two guys left tech company X and started this new thing. But a lot of them, I feel like the security founder that I encountered coming from the crypto domain, because of there's a lot of payment security, right? Let's say they work at Coinbase or something that's payment related, that they kind of started paying attention to security. Or I guess the two factor or I guess the verification side, as the Stitch founder was on our show. So there's a lot of these type of, I guess, like the fintech folks who kind of like came out and then built these kind of like interesting things. So I wonder, since like you have a very broad view of security, like number one, what is a security startup? Number two is like, can you separate them into different categories? On like, for example, I guess fintech security is one thing because I think bank is like something that like you think of the most. But when it comes to like the relevancy to a regular person, but what are other security that you feel like would be major category that will generate the most amount of venture funding or eventually exiting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think how I categorize security has also changed, and it's changed as technology has changed. Um, you know, pre-COVID and certainly pre-LLMs,
Mhm,
uh, my view of kind of the security market and categorizing it was categorizing it based on attack vector. So how do threat actors,
mhm,
access proprietary data, and how do they go and try to steal something? And that could be data, it could
mhm,
be credentials, it could
mhm,
be being able to like get your unique IP. It's a combination of different things, but in the past, I used to think of it as kind of there are three different attack vectors. There's a
mhm,
hardware-based attack vector. So,
mhm,
all the devices that are inside of your home or that are connected to a
mhm,
power plant, for example. There's certainly a software-based attack vector, and that's the one that many of us think about, whether it's your endpoint or server, identity security. And then there's a human attack vector, which is, you or I, Grace, could make
mhm,
decisions that actually are not good decisions on our part. Phishing is probably the most obvious situation. So we click on a link or we provide our credentials on purpose. The
mhm,
threat actor gets access on purpose. So that was how I thought about, kind of hardware, software, and then the human attack vector. I think what AI has forced me to do is really rethink how do we think about these categories. And today, I'd say, I think of the security industry as being two different subcategories, and then one of them has many sub subcategories. So one is kind of how do we secure AI, so security for AI, and then the other one is how do we leverage AI tooling for our existing security workflows. And I think in the second bucket, the security workflows, which is certainly where a lot of investment as well as a lot of customer buying has been happening, the way that I've actually rethought how do we categorize cybersecurity investing is based on security workflow. And within these kind of CISOs, there's a whole bunch of teams that do different things. So there is usually an IAM team, an identity access management team that's responsible for managing the global identities and privileges. So who has access to what, which apps, how much of access do they have within their
mhm,
apps? Then there's a security operations center. That team is responsible for detecting threats 24/7. So think of them as kind of your army that's sitting there. Then there's a security engineering and architecture team. That team is responsible for thinking about, you know, how does different way that we write code as well as code we write, and how do we architect applications? How is that going to potentially increase or reduce risk? And how do we manage that? That's another team. Then there's a threat intel team that's looking at figuring out what are the general threats in the environment. So, there's a whole bunch of, and we can keep going, but there's a whole bunch of different security workflows. And the way that I think of that, and fraud is another area, Grace, you mentioned crypto fraud, but the way I think about that in that subsegment is how will AI and how will large language models and more specifically today, how will AI agents go and automate some piece of that workflow. And there's some categories where there's a lot of opportunity for us to automate work today. There's some categories where it's looking like there might be opportunity. And then there's some categories that are just still further away. We don't yet know kind of what new innovation we need to have for these subcategories to work. So hopefully that answers the question in terms of how I bucket things.
for sure. I wonder, so like one part is I think I was like furiously writing these down, right? Like so we just talked about like AI agents, that's kind of like handling a piece of the workflow, right? So do you envision the future security unicorn are like just one company and then, become the, I guess, the ChatGPT version of the security side. And like that take care of like 80% of the problem. But if you want to do, I don't know, very specific things like banking or whatever, maybe there's like an app for that. But um it just like goes like, I guess, the last mile, I guess the subsector startups are like going the last mile. Or do you feel like there will be like one company takes it all that kind of fix all your AI agent like workflow in the security space in general?
I think it's a great question. So I don't think we will have one AI agent that
Mhm,
is your security AI agent and is a
mhm,
universal security AI agent. I
mhm,
think for that to happen, we would really need to see AGI working at scale.
mhm,
It's just very hard in terms of the tasks that happen inside of a security org for you to have one agent that can cover all those tasks. It's just too much of
mhm,
learning, way too much information that needs to be
mhm,
consumed and trained. So what's more likely is you will usually have for each of these people. So if there's an
mhm,
IAM analyst or a SOC analyst or a security
mhm,
engineer or an incident response analyst or a pen tester, each of these individuals will have likely an AI agent that they
mhm,
leverage to do a portion of their task. And today, maybe that's 20% or 30% of the tasks they do. And in the future, maybe it's more like 40 or 50%. I don't think it'll ever get to 100%. But I think
mhm,
we could get to 70, 80%. I think the 100% requires creativity, and that is very, very hard to do today. Going and figuring out, well, what are the intricacies of these systems and what are the threat actors doing on the back end that could, go and create an opportunity. In some ways, cybersecurity at its core is finding a needle in a haystack. You're trying to find a problem, whether you're finding it as it's happening, as the problem is happening, or you're trying to find the problem after it happened. You're trying to, find a problem and then come up with a solution. And usually that problem is there's some small change that happened inside of your system or inside of a
mhm,
process, and that created an opportunity for a threat actor. It's very, very
mhm,
hard to defend something. It's very easy actually to break it down. Breaking down things, breaking down applications is much more simple. Defending them is not so simple. It's much more
mhm.
complex.
For sure. I wanna maybe we could specifically dive into some of the company that you have worked with, and maybe we could talk about like, can you use one of your portfolio company from how you meet the company to how you kind of like evaluate the company to eventually like winning the deal to thinking about exit?
Yeah, great question. So do you want to go through the entire arc, even the exit, or are you looking for something that's kind of more recent?
I feel like it's on you. Maybe we could do both. Maybe we could do like a very, I guess, like a matured company, and then we could do like something that you're working on right now that you found really
Sure,
exciting.
let's do that. So let's do a mature company to give you a sense, and then we can do
Mhm,
something that's kind of much more newer.
mhm,
So I'll pick a mature company. There's a company I backed very early on in my venture career called Attivo Networks,
mhm,
ATTIVO, and it ended up being acquired by Sentinel One back in 2022. It was the
mhm,
largest cyber M&A deal that year. It was just under $650 million by Sentinel One.
mhm,
But that's a great example of kind of backing a unique team. So when I met
mhm,
the team, I was introduced by a close friend like you who is an angel investor,
mhm,
and you know the advantage there was he made the introduction to the founder and CEO Tushar Kotari, and I had this conversation with Tushar, and Tushar was very focused. The company was focused on deception security. And so the whole concept of deception for somebody who doesn't focus on cybersecurity, Grace, is that you have a threat actor. That threat actor is trying to go and attack an environment. Can you create a honeypot? Can you create a fake environment that looks like something they can attack? And
mhm,
by doing that, they actually get caught. So
mhm,
just like like a mousetrap, can you go and create an environment that's a virtual environment that mimics the real environment to go and find threat actors?
mhm,
And the reason you do this is twofold. One, you're obviously testing out your own defenses and you're trying to figure out who are the threat actors.
mhm.
The second is actually sometimes inside of an environment, threat actors live inside environments for many, many years before they make the decision to
Oh my
actually go and
god.
attack. So it's a great way to go and figure out if there's any, mice that are inside of your house that you just didn't know about, that are just creeping around, but
Mhm.
you want to catch them before they go and appear and start
Mhm.
wreaking havoc in your house. So that's the unique kind of opportunity with Ativo. And when we made the investment, uh, the category was still relatively early. And so what was happening was Ativo had a couple of small, customers. They were not paying a lot of money, but as a result, it made it very difficult in that you were looking at things and you were saying, hey, is this a real category? And I spent a bunch of time with my CISO network trying to go and assess, well, can this category become bigger? Can those contracts that started off as 20 or 30 or 40 or 50K end up becoming 200, 300, $500,000 and maybe even $1 million or more?
Mhm.
And it became obvious to me that this was a category that would actually go and create something that would allow that opportunity.
Mhm.
So he made the investment on that kind of vision, and it was a pretty controversial decision. Not everyone in the industry agreed with us.
Mhm.
Even not everyone on the team agreed with us.
Mhm.
Um, and once we made that investment decision, the work really got started. And I'd say the first 2 years of Deception was fantastic. We saw lots and
Mhm.
lots of growth. And then what happened was, just as things happen, CISOs kind of changed their mindset and they started looking at
Mhm.
new categories. I think what differentiated this team was they were able to adjust to the market. So as the category became less exciting for CISOs,
Mhm.
they were able to not so much pivot, but say, hey, how can we add new technology and new capabilities to still make this interesting to CISOs? So we went from deception security to detection and response. So going and
Mhm.
detecting and responding to broader threats, not just deception related, leveraging deception, and then ultimately into we help to create a new category called identity threat detection response, which is how do you go and figure out when threat actors are going and accessing very specific identities, Sid's identity or Grace's identity. And so what the team was able to do was go and say, hey, where's the puck heading and how do we go and build out new technology and new product and going after this new area of interest. And then kind of in the depths of COVID, we were debating how to how to scale things, where to focus. The company was nearing 40 million of ARR, so it was very much at a reasonable scale. And we had this amazing offer from Sentinel One, who were trying to go and enter the enterprise market. They had a
Mhm.
very large mid-market and SMB base, and they were trying to say, hey, how do we enter the enterprise market to more effectively compete against CrowdStrike, which was their core competitor in endpoint security? And they felt that Ativo and its capabilities in ITDR and identity threat detection response was an area that could be very interesting. So that was a big part behind why they made kind of the decision to acquire the company. And as a result, they ended up getting just about 400 enterprise customers immediately
Mhm.
because we already had those customers, and
Mhm.
they were able to go and figure out ways to cross sell. So it's a
Mhm.
great example of kind of you start off with something small and how do you go and scale things.
For sure. I wonder, so like since you mentioned like this company sort of like created a new category, and then I think like one of the things like about the company maybe is like easier to um for you to say yes to is like the founder is like very experienced, right? He was like the VP of Juniper and Cisco and like, had a lot of these like sales related experience to, I guess, like eventually sell to bigger companies. And I wonder when it comes down to the founders, like how do you categorize them into different categories? And then like, for the super senior people, like how do you what will be your evaluation on like who will be an actual great founder who, and like obviously a lot of these deals will have very high valuation because of they came from XYZ. um Lately we had like a lot of like these like um company that's founded by, for example, Polona is founded by like the former CTO of Tinder, and like she was the VP of Google, Instagram, LinkedIn, like, so like basically like those are like the founder who have built things at scale before. But when it comes to founding a startup, I think it requires a very different skill set. So like you have to be somewhat jack of all trades, and then you have to sell your product, be the marketing person, and then also build the product at the same time. How do you kind of like effectively judge like who will actually lead a startup to a really big successful exit like this one or IPO?
Yeah, great question. I think it's different in different subsectors. So in cyber and IT, having domain expertise does matter. Other categories, it may not matter as much. But in cyber and IT, if you look at successful founders, many of them have spent many years, sometimes decades, in
Mhm,
their subcategory, thinking about
mhm,
the category. And the reason that it matters is because, I mean, you and I, if we're
mhm,
not on the customer side or the operator side, we just can't
mhm,
go and try these products out.
mhm,
So it's really hard to go and build another data security posture management
mhm,
tool, or even come up with the concept of data
mhm,
security posture management if you've never spent any time in cyber.
mhm,
Yeah, you can go and talk to 20 people and understand what are the areas, but that, just talking to them doesn't give you an understanding of what are the problems that customers are facing. To be able to know that, you have to either be building the products for the customers, or you have to be a customer yourself actually
mhm,
using these set of products. So that's why in cyber and IT we see a lot of founders, particularly successful founders, coming with a decent amount of expertise. It's
mhm,
also, I think, part of the reason why some of the amazing accelerators that have younger
mhm,
founders, let's take YC, they don't have a lot of cyber companies, right? YC has some amazing companies that have been scaled out, but they have a lot fewer kind of cybersecurity or IT software companies. Lots of
mhm,
stuff in dev tools, lots of stuff in application software, tons of stuff in consumer and fintech, but very and crypto, but very limited on the cyber and IT infra side. It's because that domain expertise ends up being a big factor. Now, I think you put it very kindly, which is, how do you deal with these senior people? I think the more rougher way to say it is that, are the senior people humble enough to go and do the hard work of being a founder, right? Or
Also,
are they going
I
to ask
think
for their
they're
assistant and
yeah, so
solve other people?
I totally agree with you, but on the other hand, I think like they're thinking differently, right? So like for example, on the my chat with Polona AI founder, she was saying that like she wants to build like the foundation first, like so basically the infrastructure that can power eventually when this company become like a huge success, like like they may take more time to launch, but they built the infrastructure the right way so like it can they have a really huge ambition to like make this like a huge thing. So, but when you're talking to a equivalent like company founder that's like I guess like younger and more towards like the AI native side, so like people will just be like build fast, like we use Lovable to build this product, and then we'll think about like after we have like 7 million revenue last month or something. So like I think the thinking process is like very different from when you are like at a company that with like a really large scale. So I wonder how do you kind of like balance like when they have domain expertise, but on the other hand they're like too like they're like very suiting into their like past environment. Maybe it's like different as startup, or like maybe it is the right way to think of things. Oh, can we like scale from the future? Like so that now we build slow, but like we actually build things in like a very, future proof kind of way.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So I think you definitely need grit. And
Mhm,
it's funny that I say this. There are lots of amazing executives who just don't have the grit to go and do startups. And sometimes, you know, I know
mhm,
that. And sometimes, candidly, I don't know it, and I learn it because of a failed investment that we
mhm,
make. So there are lots of learnings on both of those fronts. But
mhm,
grit is a big factor. You have to be able to go and say, hey, I'm going to keep pushing as hard as I can, despite all of the
mhm,
difficulties. And every time, I have a difficult situation, I'm going to try to go and figure out what can I do to try to solve that. And also, no job will be beneath me. So,
mhm,
if you need me to go and, create a logo or clean, pick up the garbage in the office or
mhm,
something like that, I feel very comfortable doing that. At the same time, I feel very comfortable, being the key sales leader. I think that grit
mhm,
is a big factor. I think what you highlighted was kind of this bias for action. I think that's a very, very big factor. You have to have, that bias for action, to say, hey, how do I get to my first few set of customers? Because if you don't get your first set of customers, candidly, you die. There is no, in our business, it's very, very hard to go and raise lots and lots of money. Not impossible, but very hard to raise lots and lots of money if you have no customers.
mhm,
In deep tech, it's a little bit more possible. In cybersecurity, people want to see early traction. I think the third thing, which is also really important, is you have to have a vision. So
mhm,
you don't want to go and say, hey, I'm going to come up with the quickest product that the customer
mhm,
wants. You have to go and say, hey, how will this product still be relevant 3, 4, 5 years down the road when there's 25 other competitors that are trying to create a Me Too solution, as well as the larger incumbents who are going and trying to, go and build their own equivalent product. So I think that piece is a very big factor. But I think those three things, the grit, the bias for action, and having that vision and creativity, all three matter. And you want to find the right combination.
For sure. I wonder, how do you think about like distribution versus like building the product first? So like I think maybe in the security space, if you could walk us through like what does the typical sales process kind of look like? Is it like, the founder DMing the CISO on LinkedIn and then they set up a time to chat and like, 7 months later, this thing is in JP Morgan Chase. So like how do you think about the entire sales process for a security product? And then how do people build distribution at scale? Because I constantly hear about like I as a dev tool, you just like build in public and then like do some open source stuff and then you're like bam, sale to all the engineers. But yeah, like I wonder like how is there like a playbook for the security people?
Yes and no. So most of security today is enterprise sales. So that's very much field sales, which is you go and meet with customers, whether that's virtually through a Zoom call or whether that's in person to go to their office or meet them at a conference. And most of cyber is sold that way. And so as a result of that, sales cycles can be quite long. I think the shortest sales cycles end up being about 2 months. The longest ones can be 12 plus months. The JP Morgan example that you described, I mean, many of my companies have sold into JP Morgan, and the sales cycle has been well over 12 months because it is such a large bank and it does have a very complex way of thinking about vendor selection. So a big part of this is how do you get in touch? Usually it's not the CISO. Usually you're trying to get in touch with the specific person. So if you're building a tool that is automating work for the security operations center, you're trying to connect with the director of SOC operations. You're trying to connect with the person who runs that. So that's your real first touch point. They're your champion. They're the budget holder. They're the person who is going to decide whether they want to buy this tool, build their own tool, or buy another tool. And how that conversation starts can be through a multiple different ways. One could be you have your own network and you leverage your own network, whether that's the founder network or they have a set of advisors, or they have some other employees who know individuals. The second bucket could be the investor network, which is you go and leverage somebody like Sid, and I go and help you to go and find who are those early design partners. Again, usually it's a combination of all these things. One group can't do everything. The third is that you run some type of marketing campaign. You go and have a tops-down effort to go and reach to as many people as you can. And then the fourth bucket is that what you described, the DMing example, which is you go and run a very traditional kind of outbound campaign, which is you're targeting very specific individuals and you're trying to reach out to them, whether that's at a conference or whether that's through LinkedIn or other ways to reach out. And then I forgot to mention there's a final fifth kind of path, but it usually only kicks in once you have some serious customers, is the channel partner network, which is you leverage other vendors who help you to connect into customers. These are usually resellers who help with that process. So through those 4 and sometimes 5 paths, you go and get in touch with a set of customers. And usually you'll go and kind of tell them about what you're doing. And if it's a top 3 priority for them, then they'll give you an opportunity to have a second conversation. If it's not, usually they'll say, hey, this is interesting, but candidly, it's not a priority, or I have an existing tool that does this, or I think I can deal with this myself. If you meet the top 3 priority, usually they'll have a secondary call where they'll try to go and figure out, can we run a proof of concept? Then you go and let's say that's possible. Then you go and run a proof of concept. That usually can be anywhere from 2 weeks to about 6 weeks to run that whole POC. You're not paid for it. So this is, you are using resources, whether that's personnel resources, cloud resources, all of the time and effort that your team puts in. And usually you're being baked off. So there may be 2 or 3 other opportunities. Maybe they're building something internally and they're trying to assess how do you perform versus all those other groups. Now, let's say you win. So let's say you get the technical validation. Then after you get the technical validation, the champion says, hey, we want to purchase this product, Grace. We'd love to work with you. Then you go and negotiate what the price and the structure will look like. And that's usually when legal and procurement get involved. Today, legal and procurement is very complex. It is probably the biggest bottleneck that my companies and broadly companies are facing. And that process can last anywhere from a month to 2 or 3 months, which is, it's crazy to say that, but it is a big problem today.
Mhm.
So that's why the resellers are very helpful, because the advantage that the resellers have is they
Mhm.
usually have an existing contract with the
Mhm.
customer. And so as a result, they already have paper. They have a legal contract, and you can just add in your, process. So it's like a fast way of getting to a deal once you get technical validation is through the channel partners, through the resellers.
Mhm.
And so that's the whole kind of arc of going
Mhm.
from first meeting a customer to actually getting the deal closed.
Mhm. For sure. Wow, I love that. I want to be mindful of the time. Maybe we do like one real question and then a quick 1 minute fire round. One real question is like, what are some companies that you're seeing lately? So like I think you mentioned about like the really huge success one, but maybe we could talk about like a recent one that you have done. Like how do you evaluate these like AI company in the AI native solution? And is there like any AI native security company? Like you mentioned about like, AI agent that are taking care of like specific things in the process of like doing security, but like what are something that you find exciting in the AI era in the security space?
Yeah, great question. So right now, all of my investing in cyber and IT has been around kind of how do we leverage AI agents for specific security and IT workflows. So the
Mhm.
most recent investment I did was kind of in the email security space. So leveraging AI agents to go after email security. It's still stealth. The one right before that was leveraging AI agents to go and automate the work of a deputy CISO to come up with
Mhm.
security strategy. That company is called Pulse Security. The company right before that was leveraging AI agents to go after the security architect's job. So kind of the job of taking in data from the design team and the engineering team around design security design reviews, as well as how they're architecting an application, and helping security engineers to automate the work of saying, hey, this stuff is okay from a security
Mhm.
perspective and this stuff is not. That stuff is very manual, and can we go and automate that work? That company is called Prime Security. And then the company right before that is called AirMDR. And that's really automating kind of the work of detection and response, the work of the security operations center, by leveraging AI agents. And so most of the work today across these last 4 companies has been around saying, how do we leverage AI agents to go after very specific security or IT workflow?
Mhm. I love that. I wonder, okay, so since like we're very close to the end, but I still want to ask one question since I was listening to one of the podcasts you've done. It was like literally a 10 minutes podcast about you like basically critiquing someone's like pitching you, and then you kind of like gave them a quick 1 minute pitch back to them and that kind of stuff. So for the audience who wants to reach out to you, like maybe you could give us like a little tiao like how do you evaluate a founder and how long does the process take to diligence them in the security space?
Yeah, great question. So, typically so where I focus is seed stage
Mhm,
and and pre-seed stage usually.
mhm,
So
mhm,
usually I get involved when it's early days in a company's
mhm,
arc. Usually it's just the founders. Sometimes there's product, sometimes there's no product. And so my focus is always about finding interesting people going after unique problems. Sometimes they haven't yet
mhm,
identified the problem and I
mhm,
help them to think about it. Sometimes they have.
mhm,
That's a big factor in terms of how I think about things. And then what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the 3 areas that I talked about, the
mhm,
grit,
mhm,
that's a big factor. The bias for action, another
mhm,
big factor. And that vision. And certainly in cyber, I think about domain expertise.
mhm,
How will what you have done in the past be relevant to building a great company? I think in the AI world, the hardest part has been going and identifying. You still need the domain expertise, but you also need people who have either learned up on what's the new tooling or have had a history of that
mhm,
expertise. And usually we see less of the history. So you're looking for people who are creative, who are lifelong learners, who are going
mhm,
and saying, hey, I'm going to learn all the new tooling and go
mhm,
and figure out how to use it for the security use case. And so
mhm,
I am certainly looking for who are those lifelong learners who've gone and spent a bunch of time thinking about their next company. Kumar Saurabh, the founder of AirMDR, is a great example of that. Kumar was the founder of Sumo Logic, which was a fantastic
Mhm.
company in security, ended up going
Mhm.
public. Then he founded a company called Logic Hub. He sold that to another security company called Devo. And then he spent over 6 months just sitting around, Grace, and all he did was learn about AI technology.
Mhm.
His core focus was trying to figure out what is OpenAI doing, what is Claude, what's Anthropic doing with Claude. He spent all his time, reaching out on LinkedIn to AI researchers and just reading, research reports, and
Mhm.
AI research, not security research reports,
Mhm.
trying to understand how can we apply, this new technology in the security operations center in a space that he had spent the last 25 years building companies around. So by the time he came to me and he said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting my third company in this area," it was very obvious to me that this was somebody who had domain expertise and was learning, really trying to figure out how do they go and leverage AI.
Mhm. For sure. I love that. Okay, so one of the audience, Aaron, asked about like curious your take on quantum security.
Yeah, so it was great to see Aaron, listening in. I'm so happy that he's there. Um, I think quantum is a very interesting conversation. It is actually super duper early in terms
Mhm.
of how much customers care about it. I think customers are starting to think about it, and the reason they're thinking about it is that if quantum gets to any level of real scale and it works,
Mhm.
then it will completely eliminate the traditional encryption capabilities that we have built out to protect our data, to protect our credentials. So security teams are starting to think about, well, what happens in a world where quantum does reach that max, that threat actors can actually use it to just, go and brute force into an environment. So I think
Mhm.
we're in the research phase, in terms of what does it even mean to secure against, this new quantum technology, and how will encryption look like in a post kind of quantum
Mhm.
working world. um, Very early days. I think some larger companies do have research teams. Others have been very early to try to think about it. But the candid truth is that most security teams are still very focused on the basics. They're still very focused on phishing. They're still very focused on, you know, credentials that are way overprivileged. They're still very focused on ransomware. They're things that, kind of are the day-to-day
Mhm.
knock and block type of situations that you have no choice. You have to focus on.
Mm, for sure. Okay, so I want to be mindful of time. Um, we're gonna do like a quick 1 minute fire round. What's your favorite book?
Ooh, that's so hard. I'd say on the venture side, I love E-Boys. It's a book that was, written by the benchmark on the benchmark
Mhm.
team in the early days. I'm sure you've read it, given how much time you spent
Oh
in
my god,
venture.
tell me. I'm pretty sure I own this book at some point, but like yeah, like that's so interesting. I'm definitely gonna take a look. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a hard. Wow, you're asking hard questions today, Grace. I think all of my managers have made, incredible impacts on my career. I think of, Chris Bishko at Omidyar, my partner Ashu, who's done a lot for me here at Foundation. In my past career, at Barclays and investment
Mhm.
banking, I have a whole bunch of kind of VPs who helped me and helped me to think about
Mhm.
what was the kind of the area that I should focus on.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
My wife, let's just say that's an easy answer. That's who I'd invite to a dinner party.
Where can we find you outside work?
Um, I think lots of different areas, but if there's something fun I like doing, usually on weekends, it's watching Formula One. It's something I've been doing for the last 25 years. I used to watch Formula One with my mom when I was a kid. Over almost 25 years ago. I still watch it today. I now force my wife to watch it with me,
Oh my
and a few
god,
close friends. And I'm really happy that Formula One has become so big in the U.S. It's just fantastic to see.
love that. Well, Sid, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fun conversation.
Thanks, Grace.
Let me quickly end.